There are confessions you carry for decades before finding the courage to speak them. This is mine. For 37 years, I served as estate manager for the Blackwood family, guardians of one of New England's most distinguished fortunes. In all that time, I learned to navigate their silences as carefully as their marble corridors, understanding that certain questions were never to be asked, certain rooms never to be entered, and certain objects never to be disturbed. The Blackwood Heirloom collection occupied the entire third floor of their Connecticut mansion, a carefully curated museum of 4 centuries of accumulated wealth. Ming vases worth more than most homes, Renaissance paintings that museums coveted, and jewelry that once adorned European royalty. But among all these treasures, one piece commanded a reverence that bordered on fear, a mahogany box no larger than a briefcase that sat alone on a pedestal in the center of the archive room. I was told upon my hiring in 1986 that the box had remained sealed since 1743, when the family's patriarch, Cornelius Blackwood, decreed it should never be opened. No key existed, or if one did, it had been lost to time. The box bore no visible lock mechanism. Its edges sealed so seamlessly they appeared fused by centuries of stillness. For 37 years, it remained exactly as I first saw it, until last Tuesday, when I witnessed something that changed everything I believed about the nature of silence. The Blackwood family carried their inheritance like a burden disguised as privilege. Each generation seemed more distant than the last, as if the weight of their accumulated secrets pressed them deeper into themselves. Margaret Blackwood, the current matriarch, spoke in careful sentences that revealed nothing while implying everything. Her son, Jonathan, visited the estate only for legal obligations, his eyes avoiding the third floor entirely. I remember the first time Margaret showed me the archive room. She moved through the collection with practiced detachment, her fingers never quite touching any surface. When we reached the mahogany box, she stopped completely, her breathing becoming shallow. "This belonged to Cornelius," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He left specific instructions. It must never be moved, never be touched, never be opened. The family lawyers have copies of his will. These instructions are legally binding, even after 3 centuries." She paused, studying my face with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. Previous estate managers have asked questions about it. They don't work here anymore. The box itself was unremarkable in many ways. Dark mahogany, aged to a deep auburnace with brass corners that had tarnished to green. No engravings, no ornamental handles, no visible hinges. It sat there like a closed mouth, holding whatever words it was never meant to speak. I accepted the rules without question. After all, every wealthy family had their eccentricities. I never imagined that some eccentricities might be rooted in something far more unsettling than mere superstition. The first sign that something had changed came on a Monday morning in October. I arrived at the estate at precisely 7 o'clock, as I had every workday for over 3 decades. My routine was methodical. Check the perimeter, review the security logs, walk through each floor to ensure everything remained as it should be. The third floor archive room was always my final stop. I would unlock the heavy oak door, step inside, and perform a visual inventory of the most valuable pieces. The insurance company required weekly documentation, photographs of specific items to prove their continued security. That morning, as I entered the room, something felt different. The air seemed heavier, charged with an electricity I couldn't identify. The morning light filtered through the tall windows differently, casting shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. But the mahogany box sat exactly where it always had, unchanged and untouched. I completed my inventory, locked the room, and continued with my day. Yet throughout those 8 hours, I found myself thinking about the archive room, drawn by an inexplicable feeling that something was waiting for me to notice it. That evening, as I prepared to leave, I made an impulsive decision. I returned to the third floor, unlocked the archive room one final time, and stood before the mahogany box. It looked exactly as it always had. But for the first time in 37 years, I had the distinct sensation that it was looking back. Sleep became elusive after that evening. I would lie in my modest apartment, 10 minutes from the estate, and find myself thinking about the box with an intensity that felt foreign to my nature. I had always been practical, methodical, immune to flights of fancy. Yet something had awakened in that room, some awareness that seemed to pulse like a second heartbeat. The next morning brought an unusual request. Margaret Blackwood called my office directly, something she had done perhaps 5 times in all my years of service. "Harold," she said, her voice carrying a tremor I had never heard before, "I need you to check the archive room. Immediately." I found her waiting outside the oak door, still in her nightgown and robe, her face pale as winter morning. Her hands shook as she gestured toward the room. "I heard something," she whispered. "Around 3 o'clock this morning. A sound I've never heard before in this house." She unlocked the door with fingers that could barely grip the key. We entered together, and I performed my usual visual sweep. Everything appeared normal. The Ming vases, the paintings, the jewelry displays, all exactly as they should be, except for one detail that made my blood turn cold. The mahogany box sat in its usual position on the pedestal, but the layer of dust that had accumulated around its base over decades was disturbed, marked by what appeared to be fingerprints that had not been there the day before. Margaret stared at the dust patterns for a long moment, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow. Without explanation, she left the room, returning 20 minutes later with a leather-bound journal I had never seen before. "This belonged to my grandfather," she said, opening to a page marked with a faded ribbon. He wrote about the box, about what happened the last time it responded. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, dated December 15th, 1923. "The box has been active for 6 nights. Objects around it shift when no one is present. The staff are frightened. Mother says it happened once before, in 1891, sir, when great-grandfather died. She warned me that it means something is changing, something we cannot control. Cornelius left no instructions for this situation, only the eternal command that it must never be opened. But what happens when it opens itself?" Margaret closed the journal with shaking hands. "So my grandfather died 3 days after writing that entry. Heart failure, the doctors said, but my grandmother always believed it was something else. Something connected to the box." She looked at me with eyes that seemed to carry generations of carefully maintained secrets. "I need you to watch it, Harold. Document anything unusual, but under no circumstances are you to touch it or attempt to examine it closely." I agreed, though something deep in my chest was already warning me that watching might be the most dangerous thing I could do. That afternoon, I installed a security camera in the archive room, positioned to monitor the pedestal continuously. The technology felt intrusive in that space of ancient secrets, but Margaret insisted on documentation of whatever was happening. For 3 days, the recordings showed nothing unusual. The box remained motionless, the dust around it undisturbed. I began to wonder if we had imagined the fingerprints, if decades of family paranoia had infected us with false perceptions. Then came Thursday evening. I was reviewing the day's footage when I noticed something that made me rewind the recording 3 times before accepting what I was seeing. At approximately 2:47 in the afternoon, while the room was empty and locked, the mahogany box had shifted. Not dramatically, perhaps an inch to the left, then back to its original position. The movement lasted exactly 11 seconds, and it happened without any visible external force. But more unsettling than the movement itself was what followed. For nearly an hour after the box returned to its position, shadows in the room seemed to bend toward it, as if drawn by some invisible gravitational pull. The light from the windows dimmed and brightened, in patterns that defied the steady October sunshine outside. I called Margaret immediately. When she arrived, I showed her the footage. She watched in silence, her face growing paler with each replay. "It's starting again," she whispered. "Thank God help us, it's starting again." Margaret summoned me to her private study that evening, a room I had entered only twice in 37 years. The walls were lined with family documents spanning 3 centuries, legal papers that chronicled the accumulation and preservation of the Blackwood fortune. She placed several aged documents on her mahogany desk, their edges yellowed and brittle. "So, son, I've spent the afternoon reading through Cornelius's private papers. Things the family lawyers never saw. Documents that were supposed to be destroyed after his death. The first document was a letter dated October 30th, 1743, written in Cornelius's own hand. The box contains what I could not bear to carry any longer. My son's effects, recovered from the shipwreck off the Massachusetts coast. His final letter to me, written hours before the storm took his vessel, I sealed them away because his words, his accusations, they carry a weight that threatens to destroy what remains of my reason. Margaret's voice trembled as she read. Cornelius had a son, Thomas. He died at sea when he was 22 years old. The family records always claimed it was an accident, but this letter suggests something different. She showed me another document, Thomas's final correspondence to his father. The ink was faded, but the words were legible enough to understand why Cornelius had sealed them away. It was a confession of discoveries, accusations of corruption, and a promise to expose his father's business practices upon his return to shore. A promise the storm had prevented him from keeping. The security footage from Friday night revealed the box's most dramatic movement yet. At 11:38 in the evening, it began to rotate slowly on its pedestal, completing a full revolution over the course of 7 minutes. As it moved, every other object in the room seemed to lean toward it, as if the box had become the center of some invisible force field. But the most disturbing detail was the sound the camera's microphone captured, a low humming, barely audible but constant, that seemed to emanate from within the sealed wood. I enhanced the audio, and beneath the humming I could detect what sounded like whispered words, though I could never quite distinguish what they were saying. Margaret arrived at the estate the next morning, looking as though she had not slept. She had spent the night reading through more of Cornelius's hidden papers, uncovering a family history that painted a very different picture of the Blackwood legacy. Thomas wasn't the golden son we were told about, she said, her voice hollow with exhaustion. He was investigating his father's shipping business, discovering that Cornelius had built the family fortune through slave trading and deliberate shipwrecks for insurance money. Thomas threatened to expose everything. She paused, staring out the window toward the family cemetery, where generations of Blackwoods rested under elaborate marble monuments. The storm that killed Thomas wasn't an accident. Cornelius paid the ship's captain to ensure his son never made it home alive. That revelation transformed my understanding of everything I had witnessed. The box wasn't simply an heirloom. It was a repository of guilt, a sealed confession that had festered for nearly 3 centuries. Thomas's belongings, his final letter, his accusations of murder and corruption, all locked away by a father who had chosen wealth over his son's life. The whispers from the security footage began to make horrifying sense. I played the enhanced audio for Margaret, and we both heard it clearly this time, a young man's voice repeating the same phrase over and over. "You killed me, father. You killed your own son." Margaret wept as she listened, understanding finally why her family had carried such deep sadness for generations. The wealth that had sustained them, the fortune that had built their mansion and maintained their status, was blood money earned through murder and betrayal. "Thy every generation has felt it," she whispered. "This weight, this sorrow we could never explain. We thought it was the burden of privilege, but it was guilt. Inherited guilt for what Cornelius did." That afternoon the box moved again, this time sliding 6 inches across the pedestal before stopping. The humming grew louder, more insistent, and new words began to emerge from within. 300 years, the voice said. 300 years of silence. Let me speak. Let me tell them what he did. The box was no longer asking for attention. It was demanding justice. Sunday evening brought the moment I had been dreading. Margaret and I were in the archive room, documenting the box's latest movements, when the impossible happened before our eyes. Without warning, without any visible mechanism or external force, the mahogany box began to open. The lid lifted slowly, as if raised by invisible hands, revealing an interior lined with faded blue velvet. Inside, perfectly preserved despite 3 centuries, lay the belongings Thomas Blackwood had carried to his death: a leather journal, a gold pocket watch, a miniature portrait of a young woman, and a sealed letter bearing his father's name. The whispers stopped. The humming ceased. For the first time in days, the room fell completely silent. With trembling fingers, Margaret reached for Thomas's final letter. The wax seal broke at her touch, and she unfolded pages that had waited 300 years to be read by eyes other than Cornelius's. Thomas's handwriting was urgent, passionate, filled with the righteousness of youth discovering evil. "Father, I have seen the manifests. I know what cargo your ships truly carried, and I know what happened to the vessels that disappeared in convenient storms. When I return, I will present this evidence to the authorities. Your fortune is built on murder, and I will not be complicit in your crimes. If something happens to me during this voyage, know that others have copies of these documents. The truth will survive, even if I do not." Margaret's hands shook as she finished reading. "He knew," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking. "Thomas knew his father was going to kill him, and he prepared for it. I searched through the box's remaining contents, finding Thomas's journal filled with meticulous documentation of his father's crimes, ship manifests, correspondence with corrupt captains, records of deliberately sunk vessels and their human cargo. Thomas had spent months gathering evidence, building a case that would have destroyed Cornelius and exposed the true source of the Blackwood fortune. But there was something else in the journal, something that explained why the box had finally opened after 3 centuries of silence. Thomas had written extensively about his visits to the family cemetery, about sensing the presence of others who had suffered at Cornelius's hands. He believed that the victims of his father's crimes were waiting for justice, gathering strength, preparing to speak through him. "The dead don't rest when they die unavenged," he had written. "They wait, and they watch, and eventually they find a way to be heard." Margaret looked up from the journal, understanding finally why her family had lived under such a pall of inexplicable sadness. As they've been waiting all this time. All those people who died for our wealth, they've been waiting for someone to acknowledge what happened to them. The box, now empty, sat open on its pedestal like a mouth that had finally spoken its truth. The whispers had stopped, but the weight of what we had learned pressed down on us like centuries of accumulated grief. In the days that followed, Margaret made a decision that would transform the Blackwood legacy forever. She contacted historians, genealogists, and maritime archaeologists, sharing Thomas's evidence and beginning the long process of uncovering the full extent of Cornelius's crimes. The family fortune, built on blood and betrayal, would be used to establish a foundation dedicated to researching the victims of historical maritime atrocities. The Blackwood estate would become a center for scholars studying the slave trade and insurance fraud in colonial shipping. Thomas's belongings were donated to a maritime museum, his evidence preserved as historical documentation of the corruption that had shaped early American commerce. His portrait was placed in the estate's main hall, finally claiming his rightful place in the family history. As for the mahogany box, it remains on its pedestal in the archive room, but it has never moved again. The whispers have ceased, the humming has stopped, and the shadows fall naturally once more. Whatever had been trapped within those sealed walls has found its peace. I continue to serve as estate manager, but my role has changed. Instead of guarding family secrets, I help researchers access the truth that was hidden for 3 centuries. The weight that had pressed down on the Blackwood family for generations has finally lifted. Sometimes, late in the evening, I stand in the archive room and remember that Tuesday when everything changed. The box that had held Thomas's truth for 300 years sits open and empty, its silence no longer ominous but peaceful. The dead, it seems, rest easier when their stories are finally told.